Did you use soap? Hey, welcome to The Whole Truth, where I am taking you through the entire Bible from Genesis all the way to Revelation, and we are not skipping anything. So if that sounds good to you, what do? Reach down, hit the little subscribe button below. There's a free way to support this channel. It's liking, sharing, and commenting. And I know some people don't like it when YouTubers say like and share and comment, but the truth of the matter is that's the way social media works. And I'm putting out all these videos here on YouTube, and they cost you nothing to be able to watch. So a simple like or leave me a little comment down below, that's free and it's easy to do. If you'd like to take that even further, if you say, Justin, I am loving this content where you're going and teaching all the way through the entire Bible, then you can support that over at Patreon, patreon.com/thewholetruth. And I'm also providing study notes that will be, I hit the wrong one. We're providing study notes. I'm providing study notes that will go along with each and every single video. So today's, it looks like this. Okay, I don't know if you'll be able to see it. It's like the one on the side. Can you see that? It's always hard. Look, there's a ring light in the way. Look, see, you've got notes, 3 pages of notes that go along with today's video. And you can get those if you jump over on Patreon. And then over on Patreon, you can support the channel and you get access to the study notes. And then I'm working on the Joshua ones. Actually, as I'm filming this, I'm working on all of the notes from Joshua, putting those into a book that we'll be able to have as a digital book and also a printed book that you'll be able to buy. So I'm trying to work out all the details. Never done anything like this before. It's a growing channel and you can come along with me on this journey. Now, all of that stuff, that is not the most important. The most important is that you grab your Bibles. Get your Bibles, open them up to Judges chapter 1. We're doing the book of Judges. We're studying through the entire book, and it is some of the most wild stories that you will see in all of the Bible. I mean, huge, big, wild stories. And it's interesting as we talk through what's going to happen in Judges, because it's more than just like, these fairy tales of almost superheroes, and some of them even are like kind of superheroes in their actions. It's more than that. And here's why it's more than that. Because Judges is a bridge. It is a bridge book that gives us an understanding about all of the kings in Israel. Like, where did they come from? How did all of this happen? Why are things the way that they are? How did we get from the Israelite people being in slavery in Egypt in the book of Exodus, and then in the books of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, you're really just seeing Israel in the wilderness and Israel getting the law and Israel becoming this nation, like God's nation. And then they're supposed to go into the promised land. They go into the promised land. And how do we get from them like marching into the promised land and marching around Jericho and all of that? How do we get from that to kings like Saul and David? And then we'll get into the wicked kings. After we get through David and Solomon, you're going to get Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and you're going to go down the line as Israel is split. And there are all of these different kings. And I'll just spoil it right now for you and tell you that when you get into the books of the Kings and Chronicles, and you see the kings in Israel, do you know how many good kings you're going to see in Israel after you get through David and then Solomon? None. All the ones in Israel, they're all going to be wicked. How do we get to that point? Well, Judges is the bridge. Judges is the book that gets you from that point to where Israel will be. And we have to understand some kind of preliminary things, that God is initially establishing a theocracy. This is going to be where God will be their king and they will be his people. And you have to remember that God instructed this. Like, God wanted the Israelite people to do exactly that he would be their God and they would be their people. He would be their king. He would be their leader. He would be the one that they would follow. Well, up until this time, though they have not had a king, they have had a leader. They've had a person to follow. So they were following Moses. Remember when God revealed himself to the Israelite people and they said, oh, we never want to experience that again. This was in the book of Exodus. They were like, we never want to experience that again. Moses, you go talk to him for us. And they sent Moses as a representative of all of them and said, go have Moses talk for us. When Moses died, when he went up on the mountain and he died, Joshua was put in his place. Well, now all the people have been able to follow Joshua and follow Caleb and the elders. But eventually they're going to die off. They did die off. We've seen the death of Joshua, and that is where Judges will pick up. But now we're going to see no new leader is established by God. They're not given a Moses. They're not given a Joshua. Those men were typologies of Jesus, but they are now instructed to go through the promised land. They're supposed to finish the job. This is what Joshua told them before he died. You can watch that series. Go back and watch that series. Joshua said, finish the job that God's called you to do. Go through and conquer the land. Drive out the Canaanite people. But they don't. They don't do it. They don't drive out all of the Canaanite people. And that's what causes the problems. And that's the story today. I didn't mean for the intro of this to take 6 minutes, but we have to understand Judges. I'll get a little bit more into like what's happening in the whole book after we read this first section. So let's start out by reading this first section in Judges. If you've got the PDF, if you've got the study notes, you can go grab those and come along with me. And we're in Judges chapter 1. We will start in verse 1. And we're going to read the first 10 verses to get started. Now, after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Indeed, I have delivered the land into his hand. And so Judah said to Simeon, his brother, come up with me to my allotted territory, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I will likewise go with you to your allotted territory. And Simeon went with him. And then Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they killed 10,000 men at Bezek. And they found Adonai-Bezek in Bezek and fought against him. And they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And then Adonai-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. And Adonai-Bezek said 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to gather scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. And then they brought him to Jerusalem, and there he died. Now the children of Judah fought against Jerusalem and took it. They struck it with the edge of the sword, and they set the city on fire. And afterward the children of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who dwelt in the mountains in the south and in the lowland. And then Judah went against the Canaanites who dwelt in Hebron. And now the name of Hebron was formerly Kirjath Arba. And they killed Sheshai, Ahimem, and Talmai. That's the first section. And what do we see? We see that there's no leader. There's not another Joshua. It's not like Joshua died and now Caleb's going to be the leader, and then Caleb died and now this other guy's going to be the leader. Remember that Joshua was their conqueror. He went in, he is a typology, and he went in and helped them to conquer the land and subdue the land. They have subdued the major portion of the land, but there is a job that needs to be finished. There is a job that needs to be done. And in chapter 1 of Judges, what we find is that the Israelite people do not do that job. Now that's going to send them into a cycle that they will repeat, but we'll do that in chapter 2. So I don't want to go over the cycle that they're going to repeat too much as I want to point out why things end up the way that they do. We see that there's no leader, and without a leader, the people did the right thing. They went and they said, who's going to go up before us? Who's going to help us to fight? And God gave them an answer and told them Judah. Judah is the one that is going to fight. And so they're all going to go with Judah. Judah is going to kind of lead the charge, if you will, to drive out the rest of the Canaanites, to drive out the rest of the ites, the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Perizzites and the Amorites, all of those that live in the land of Canaan, the land of promise, that Judah is going to go in and begin to help. So Judah says to Simeon, hey, come with me. And they go and they fight against this Bezek. They fight against Adonai-Bezek and his men. They kill 10,000 men. And it seems like it's like a rough part of the story when we read that they cut off his thumbs and they cut off his big toes. I mean, that's gruesome. Listen, I'm not about gruesome. I don't really like gruesome stuff. I don't like gruesome movies. It's hard for me to picture those kinds of things. I don't think that I could do that to a man. I don't think that I could go in and cut off his right thumbs, or not his right thumbs, but all of his two thumbs, all of his thumbs. Like he's got 40 thumbs. No, he has two thumbs. They cut off his thumbs. They cut off his big toes. Like that's gruesome to me. I don't fully understand that. Except this, that it's a punishment. We quickly see, as I read that gruesome part, and by the way, there are going to be lots of gruesome parts in the book of Judges. And so this is just a taste, like this is just a beginning part. But if you really think about this man who's now been deformed, his hands have been maimed, his feet have been maimed. And what they're doing is they're, in a warlike way, what they're doing is disabling this man from being able to fight. He can't grab a sword now. He can't hold on to a sword. He doesn't have balance the way that he used to. He is no longer going to be the warrior that he once was. So I understand the practical. I'm just simply stating the obvious. It's gruesome. It's a harsh thing that he's going through. But even more than harsh or gruesome, even more than practical for a time of war in an ancient world when hand-to-hand combat was the means of defeating your enemy, even more than all of that, there's one more thing that I would point out, which is what Adonai-Bezek pointed out himself. He said, I've done this to 70 other kings. As a matter of fact, they ate scraps under my table like a dog. Now, just think about that for a moment. Have you ever had a dog that sat at your table while you ate and ate and ate, and then finally you were done with the chicken, and so you finally throw a little piece to the dog? That's what these grown men, in his picture, that's what they were doing. They ate scraps under his table. He sat there and tortured them and ate in front of them while they were starving to death, and finally threw them a scrap and watched them fight over who was going to get the scrap with their missing thumbs and their missing big toes while they're wrapped up in chains. And everybody got a good laugh at it. Do you understand? We've said this before. I've said this before. The people in Canaan were a wicked people. They were a wicked people, and God was sending in Israel as part of their judgment. God had allowed Canaan, we've read this before, so I'm not going to take you back there again, but Canaan had been a wicked people, and God had given them time to repent. They had not repented. They had not changed. They were doing the same things over and over, and so God was now going to punish them. And God had told the same thing to Israel. If you'll do what's right, I'll be your God and I'll bless you. But if you don't do what's right, then I'll send in someone to oppress you so that you'll change. So this is the punishment that Canaan deserved. This was the punishment that God was giving them. Now, Judges is more than about the conquering. That was really the book of Joshua. The point that we have here is what happens next. Because they're supposed to go in and drive out all of the Canaanites. They're supposed to rid all of the Canaanite people. And it starts with simple obedience. Judah and Simeon are they're beginning to do what they were supposed to do. They are driving out the people of Canaan. And so it started with this Adonai-Bezek, and they killed 10,000 men, and they caught the king, and they even killed the king. They're doing what they're supposed to do. But that's not where the story is going to end today. Look at what happens next in verses 11 and following. From there they went against the inhabitants of Deber, and the name of Deber was formerly Kirjath-Sepher. And then Caleb said, whoever attacks Kirjath-Sepher and takes it, to him I will give my daughter Axa as wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, and so he gave him his daughter Axa as wife. And now it happened when she came to him that she urged him to ask her father for a field. And she dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, "What do you wish?" And so she said to him, "Give me a blessing. Since you have given me land in the south, give me also springs of water." And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. And now the children of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the children of Judah in the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the south near Arad, and they went and dwelt among the people. And Judah went with his brother Simeon and attacked the Canaanites who inhabited Sephath and utterly destroyed it until the name of that city is called Hormah. Also Judah took Gaza with its territory, Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. And so the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers. But they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland because they had chariots of iron. Isn't that interesting? They had chariots of iron. Now, Judah had already gone in and destroyed the city. They'd burned Jerusalem, the city of palms. They had already gone in and conquered that territory. But when they get into the lowlands and they get into the mountains, the mountaineers, they can't get rid of all of those people. I say can't. I should put that in quotes over here. They can't get rid of all of those people. Why can't they get rid of all those people? Because they had chariots of iron. Read what we see then in verse 20. And they gave Hebron to Caleb as Moses had said, and they expelled from there the 3 sons of Anak. But the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem. And so the Jebusites dwelt with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. What are we seeing? Partial obedience. They are not fulfilling the thing that they are supposed to do. They are supposed to drive out all of the Canaanites, but they're not driving out all of the Canaanites. And so what do we see now is this like partial obedience. They're not driving out everybody because they can't. They can't defeat the chariots of iron. Well, I can't help but to think about the story of Moses. When Moses delivered the people out of Egypt, do you remember what happened? That they came to the Red Sea and God parted the Red Sea with Moses' leadership. Moses parts the Red Sea. God parts the Red Sea for them. All the Israelite people went through on dry ground, but when the Egyptians came after them, do you remember that as the Egyptians came after them, do you remember what happened? One of the reasons that the Egyptians were not able to catch up is because their chariots got stuck in the mud. Now, all the Israelites had crossed on dry ground, but their chariots had got stuck in the mud. I find it interesting that they can't defeat these Canaanites who live in the lowlands because they have chariots of iron. Chariots should not be the issue for the Israelite people. Remember, they requested of the Lord who should lead them. The Lord gave them an answer. He told them, Judah. They've already defeated in Jerusalem. They've already won in Jerusalem. What is the problem? Is the problem that they're not strong enough? No. Is the problem that God is not with them? No. The problem is incomplete obedience. God will fulfill his part if the people will do the thing he's called them to do. But if the people are going to be disobedient, God's not going to force obedience on them. God wants obedience from them, and he makes obedience possible for them, but they still have a job to do. They still have to fulfill the thing that God has called them to do. Let me try to give you an example of this. I believe that God will fulfill the thing he's called us to do. Those who he calls those are the people he enables. He enables us. If he calls us, he's not going to call us to something that he's not going to fulfill. I remember once going into the hospital with a man, and the man asked me if I would pray for him. He asked me to come in and pray with him and pray that he would be healed. And so I totally agreed. I would love to do that. And so I went to the hospital to go pray with this man who was in the hospital. And when I got there, we were chatting for a moment. And then he said, well, if you could just pray that the doctors would be able to give me a quick recovery. And I remember saying, oh, okay, like I'm totally down for that. But I thought you wanted to ask for healing. And he looked at me like I was crazy. And he said, I'm all about asking for healing, but I don't think that God's just going to stand me up out of this bed. Well, there you have it. Listen, if you don't believe God's going to stand you up out of that bed, then is God going to stand you up out of the bed? You see what I'm saying? They've requested who should lead them in battle. God gave them an answer. Judah was leading them into battle, but then Benjamin doesn't drive out all the people. That you start to see that they're not driving out all the people like they're supposed to. It's a partial obedience. It's not full obedience. They're not fully doing what God has told them to do. Why didn't they go to God and say, Lord, how do you want us to defeat these people? They have iron chariots. But instead, they let them dwell there. And we're going to see that progression as more and more, this is the whole point of the chapter, more and more of the tribes are allowing the Canaanites or the Hittites or whoever to stay inside of the land. And they try to control that, but we're going to see a progression. We're going to see we're going to see the wreck. We're going to see the wreck that happens as they tried to allow people to stay, and they only tried to fulfill part of what God told them to do. So pick up with me. Let's read in verse 21 again. But the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabit Jerusalem. And so the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. And the house of Joseph, now pay attention to that. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And so the house of Joseph sent out men to spy out Bethel. The name of that city was formerly Luz. And when the spies saw a man coming out of the city, they said to him, please show us the entrance to the city, and we will show you mercy. And so he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and his family go. And the men went to the land of the Hittites, built a city, and called its name Luz, which is its name to this day. However, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and the villages of Taanach and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ebleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. For the Canaanites were determined to dwell in that land. And it came to pass when Israel was strong that they put the Canaanites under tribute, but did not completely drive them out. Oh boy, it's really starting to heat up. Look at verse 29. Now did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer? Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer. And so the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. And nor did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalol. So the Canaanites dwelt among them and were put under tribute. Nor did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or Alab, or Akzib, Helbah, Aphik, or Rehob. And so the Asherites dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Nor did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anath. But they dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. And nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath were put under tribute to them. And the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley. And the Amorites were determined to dwell in Mount Hir, in Ajalon, and in Shalbim. And yet the strength of the house of Joseph became greater. And when the strength of the house of Joseph became greater, they were put under tribute. And now the boundary of the Amorites was from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. Whoa. Let's talk about what just happened. Let's talk about the progression of things that just happened. It started with, there's some iron chariots, some Canaanites with iron chariots in the lowlands, and we couldn't get those guys out of there. But then Benjamin just doesn't drive out all of the people that they were supposed to drive out. And then we just see this cycle of like one after another. And I pointed out to you that Joseph drove out some people, but then we see Manasseh doesn't drive out some people. Now, what's important about that? Because Manasseh is of Joseph. Joseph was divided into two tribes. And because remember Joseph, the story of Joseph, the coat of many colors, and Joseph became the second in command in Egypt. So Joseph is the one who saved all of his brothers, the guy, Joseph. And then he had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. So Ephraim and Manasseh are both of Joseph. So we see that there was victory given, but then Manasseh just chooses not to drive out all of the inhabitants of all of these different areas. Why is this so important? Because what we're seeing is this partial obedience and this disobedience is growing. And there's more, and there's more, and there's more that are being allowed to stay in the land. Now, what is the problem with allowing them to stay in the land? I mean, it says that they put them under tribute. Couldn't they become rich? Couldn't they make money off of the Canaanites who are there? I mean, is it really that important that they drive out the Canaanites? Well, it is that important, and I want to give you a couple of reasons why it is so important that they would drive out the Canaanites. Number one is simple obedience. God told them to do it, so they should do it. You know, if everything else fails, it doesn't take a rocket scientist, it doesn't take a theologian, it doesn't take a Bible degree, it doesn't take a theology degree for you to understand how to be obedient. Even if you don't understand, you can be obedient. And that's a word for somebody right now. Maybe God's calling you to something. Maybe God's calling you to baptism. Maybe God's calling you to do something in your church to serve. And maybe you say, I don't understand. I had a woman one time tell me, she said, I've already done all those things. I've already served in all those ways. Why would God call me to do that again? Well, I may not know the why, but if God's calling you, you should follow the thing that he's calling you to do. Now, the second thing is this. The problem with leaving the Canaanites in the land is it is tempting to the Israelite people. The Israelite people now will be tempted to follow the things that the Canaanites do. And that becomes a problem. Remember what I told you, Judges is a bridge. So when you get into the later chapters and the later books where Israel is constantly dipping into idolatry, that started in the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, they don't drive all the people out. And so what ends up happening over and over again in Israel is they constantly go back to worshiping idols. How do they end up worshiping idols? Because there were idol worshipers who were left inside of Israel. And it gets so bad. What we see here is this like progression of humanity in sin. I mean, we're seeing it as typified through Israel, who allowed a little bit to stay, allowed a few of them to stay. They're putting them under tribute, right? Like they could put them into forced slavery. They could make them work. They could make money off of them, right? All of those things could seem like good things, right? Like the Canaanites could work the land. They know the area, whatever. But the problem is multifold. It's multifaceted. Number one, obedience. Number two, they're going to become a problem for Israel in the sense of like they're going to lead them into idolatry. And number three, they become a problem like what we see happen. Because not only do they refuse to leave the land, but then it gets so bad that they end up driving, when you get into verse 34, and the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains. Whoa, did you hear the progression? We went from not driving out one group to not driving out many groups, but putting them under tribute. And now all of a sudden, this other group is fighting back so hard that Dan is now not even dwelling in their own territory, but they're being driven out. They're the ones who are now having to go hide in the mountains because the Amorites are refusing to leave. Oh, don't you see the progression of sin? This is what happens in our own lives as we leave a little something. One time there was a guy that asked me to help him and asked me to pray for him because he wanted to stop smoking. He said, I just can't stop smoking and I want to stop. And I said, well, let's give it to the Lord and then let's quit. You got to do both. You need to give it to the Lord and you've got to be obedient. And so he was standing there. We prayed and then we went outside. We were outside of the church and we were standing there talking for a moment, and just natural force of habit. He even said force of habit. He pulls a pack of cigarettes out of his pocket, gives him the cigarette box tap, opens the lid and pulls out a cigarette. And the whole time I'm literally just standing. I do this thing where people do stuff like that and I won't speak. I'll just go like this. I use a little program that like cuts parts for me, so it like cuts out silent parts. So I don't know if you'll be able to see that or not, but I'll just slow blink. People who know me, they call it the slow blink, where I just kind of blink real slow, but I won't say anything when it happens. And so I'm slow blinking this guy. I'm just kind of like blinking repetitively to let him know that I'm annoyed with what I'm seeing. And he still goes ahead and tries to light the cigarette. Like he's putting the lighter up, he's lighting the lighter. And I was like, and I put my hand out. He put the cigarette in my hand. He like takes it and like reluctantly, he's like, puts the cigarette in my hand. But he does this. He starts to take the pack of cigarettes and put it back. And I went, now come on, if you keep that box of cigarettes, you're going to be smoking again. He said, no, I'm not going to smoke again. And I said, if you keep that box of cigarettes, you certainly will. And here was his reason. You know what he said? He goes, if I can't resist this box of cigarettes in my pocket, then how am I going to resist the box of cigarettes that's near the cash register? I mean, if I really want to smoke, I'll just go buy a pack. And I said, yeah, but if you really want to quit, you'll hand me that pack. He wouldn't hand me the pack of cigarettes. And the very next time I saw him, he was smoking again. And as much as I ever knew the man, he never stopped. Now, isn't that something? He wanted to quit. He said he wanted to quit, but he didn't want to give up the box of cigarettes. He wanted to keep it with him. You see, it's like a partial obedience. That's what we're seeing from Israel, but we see it in ourselves and we see it in our humanity. And the problem is that sin leads to death. Sin leads to future problems. And that's what happened. So how did they finally get out of that? Like, how does Dan get out of that? Well, let's see. But notice what happens with it. It happened in verse 35. Now the Amorites were determined to dwell in Mount Heres, in Ajalon, and in Shalbim, and yet the strength of the house yet when the strength of the house of Joseph became greater, they were put under tribute. Joseph, that's Manasseh and Ephraim, when they become stronger, they come in and they get Dan to be able to come out of the mountains. Did they drive out all of the Amorites? Nope. They put them under tribute. They did the same thing again, leaving a little bit, thinking that they have it under control, but it's the same process that's going to happen again. You know, there's only one way for Dan to come there was only one way for Dan to come out of the mountains. Do you know what that was? They needed help. They needed outside help. I remember this one time I had model cars. I used to love making model cars. Now I always had that little model car glue, but it dried so slow. And so one day I got a hold of super glue, and I was going to use super glue to put the model cars together. And I loved using super glue. It was so fast. I mean, hold them together for about 20 seconds and bam, it was done. But I got the littlest bit of super glue on my finger. And in my mind, I was going to do this and I was going to rub it off. Can you hear that? Is that like ASMR? Okay. So like I was going to rub them like this, and I was going to rub it off. And I went like this and went to rub, and they were stuck. Like, I mean, I'm peeling. I cannot get it. And I can see this like little point of skin where, I mean, it was stuck, and it's now becoming painful when I'm pulling. I couldn't get it off there. I went and I put it under water, and I think that just like activated it or something, made it worse. And I couldn't get my fingers apart. I finally had to go to my mom. I'm like, Mom, I don't know what to do. I got my fingers stuck. And I thought I was going to have to go to the hospital or something. And she was like, I think mayonnaise will do it. And so she went and got a scoop of mayonnaise, and she put mayonnaise on there. And sure enough, the mayonnaise got them right apart. But if I didn't have outside help, there was no way I was getting those fingers apart without a lot of pain. And that's kind of the representation that I'd like to give you about sin. And that's what we see in this chapter, a little bit, leaving a little bit, partial obedience. But the end result of that is pain. It was pain for Dan, and they couldn't get out of it until they got some outside help. Well, we have outside help. And that outside help to keep us out of sin is Jesus Christ. He is the one that can separate us from sin. And do you know why he can do that? Because he had complete obedience. Do you remember what John the Baptist said of Jesus when he came to the water to be baptized? Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Jesus is our great deliverer who separates us from our sin. And our trust and our faith is in him who has completed the law of God, where we have failed and fallen short, whether purposefully or whether by omission. Whether it was knowingly or ignorantly, we have failed over and again, but Jesus has never failed. And so we put our trust in him who completely fulfilled the law, and then he makes us complete. We can be complete in him. Well, I sure hope you've enjoyed today's introduction and Judges chapter 1 and this introduction to Judges. And I hope that you'll come back tomorrow as we're going to see the cycle that happens inside of Israel, the cycle of sin that they're going to go through, and it'll paint a picture for what's going to happen in all of the rest of Judges. So I hope to see you then.